Experience that we had at the Interaction Design CRC around the Jam project, which seemed to be beneficial and to show promise in relation to some of these digital interactions which were previously used almost exclusively for professional artists being brought into this space and then having a different kind of utility and an unexpected kind of utility, but nonetheless. So I'll talk a little bit about that. First of all, I'm aware that whenever we talk about digital technologies and arts, generally the expectations are these kinds of things. We sort of imagine some kind of robot musician sort of playing some inane kind of music and this sort of complex things, and the technology is inhuman and it's going to cost us a fortune and it's going to be isolating and blah 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 blah. So I just want to get this out up front, right? This is what I expect that most people are thinking. But I think that we're entering an age where this is not necessarily true, that these things are being overcome and that everybody's carrying in their pocket a computational device in the form of some smartphone, which is infinitely powerful in relation to all of the kinds of things we're talking about, and there's ways in which we can overcome that. But I'm aware that this is the backdrop, which is possibly a negative one, and we need to overcome it. But instead, what I'd like to talk about is the opportunities that these technologies can bring, given that there are potential hurdles that we may need to overcome in order to implement them well. And even in our activities that Barb talked about somewhat, we know that there are all sorts of barriers and all sorts of resources, as Andy was talking about, that need to be brought to bear. But nevertheless, I think there's a trajectory here that those barriers are becoming smaller and smaller, the resources are becoming more and more available, and so perhaps part of the vision, in a sense, that we can provide from a research kind of focus is just this kind of forecasting. This is where these things are going. Maybe there's some opportunity to share that around as well. But of course we know that technologies have all these kinds of capacities. They can enable us to do things that we've never done before, or they can connect us, we know that, we send emails all the time, we have Skype calls and we do these kinds of things. We also know that they enhance or augment our capacity. Technology's always done that. If we want to dig a hole, it's better to do it with a spade, It's even better to do it with a front-end loader, This is the role of technologies, and we've known this even academically for a long time. So this is a really famous book out in which this kind of idea was articulated in the 1960s. Marshall McLuhan, understanding media. So his notion that all media are extensions of human capabilities. And I think there's a poignant kind of thing here, which I don't profess to understand, but I think it's an interesting kind of irony almost, that we talk about these notions of media extending human capacities, and then when we're talking about people who in some way or other may have some diminished capacity or assessed as being disabled in some way or somehow vulnerable, perhaps there's some opportunity for some technology to play a part in sort of supporting or scaffolding those kinds of things as well. I mean, maybe there's something there. I haven't thought through that a lot, but there is this notion that the technologies can amplify our capacities. That's one other thing. On the reverse of that, bringing forward, exposing these capacities which may otherwise not be evident, because of some inability to communicate or some inability to demonstrate them in some way in which we would expect in our society. So we take music, for example. There's certain capacities which are necessary often to do acoustic instrument making. One of them is physical dexterity. Right? You've got to play a clarinet, you've got to move your fingers up and down fast. If you can't do that or some other thing, then maybe there's some musical expression which is in you which is difficult to get out. Maybe there is some way in which a technology can enable that expression to be revealed. you know, in a way which is non-traditional in a sense, you know, but still valid and authentic, and these are the kinds of things which we've noticed. There's been a lot of talk about documentation, and I think it's a really critical aspect to what's going on. But kind of at the heart of my talk is just to share with you an idea that I think the professional artistic community working with digital technologies and some of the leading edge technology companies are starting to move into a space which would be seen to be beyond documentation, beyond representation. But nevertheless, we know that computing systems are good, and there's been ample discussion today already about the ability for computing systems to store video, capture, transform, send, etc. So I won't labour that, you understand it. So what I'm suggesting, however, is that there is another kind of capacity which is not so well understood in relation to computing, and basically that's because you can program it. It can do things autonomously. With sufficiently well-crafted programming, that can appear as agency. Yeah. It can appear as autonomy. It can appear as another, you know, as if it were another. And that other can either be some point of communication or dialogue, or it can be some point of support or enhancement. And I think there's all sorts of opportunities here which we've yet to flesh out. But I guess my point here really is just to be provocative in one sense and say, what about this idea of computational agency, of thinking about technology, particularly computing technology, as some form of independent other with which we can have a relationship, or which can be part of a network of relationships, and how, rather than thinking about computing things as a medium through which we communicate, or a tool like a spade with which we try and do something, but as a kind of an entity with agency which can take on a whole bunch of roles, yeah, in some autonomous or semi-autonomous fashion, which might provide us with opportunities for action that we hadn't previously anticipated. And so these are some of the sorts of characteristics of these systems that I think are leading to that, and this is just an image of a computer-drawn artwork. So this is what this is one system. The computer can do this by itself, in the sense that, you know, after being programmed, it has a camera and it looks at something, and then it sort of amply sends a pen on a bit of paper, scooting around the little robot, you know, drawing stuff. But the point is, the computer can do this by itself. What happens if we pair up these kinds of computing systems with people, and what's the joint kind of opportunities for expression? So what's emerging in this kind of space is these notions of what I've called here participatory partnerships between people and computing systems. And why have I got an aeroplane? I think this is a fantastic example of where the leading edge of this stuff is at the moment, right? So this is an Airbus cockpit. Basically what happens, of course, is that the pilots fly by wire, they call it. You know, the pilots just kind of go, well, I think we probably should land now, right? It's about time to land. And then the computer sort of gets in and goes, move the flaps, turn the engines down, you know, etc. Basically, the pilots almost don't need to be there, right? They're almost only there as a risk management exercise. Tests have shown that the computer is much more capable of landing the aircraft than the pilot is, right, under optimal circumstances. And so you're flying in this aeroplane, the person is there doing some stuff, making some decisions, and the computing system is making other decisions. And this is where we found ourselves in some of the work that we were doing is, well, what are the decisions that should be or could be taken by human participants? And what are other decisions which should be or could be taken by computing systems, such that they form a good partnership in order to get the outcome we want? In our case, it was just creative expression, making art, making music, not flying an aeroplane, but the principles are basically the same. And why do this? Just so you can see that it actually does have a translation. So John McCormick is a Melbourne-based visual artist, and these artworks here are the result of him programming a system which evolves sort of semi-autonomously, and he guides it and produces these artworks. And the lower one is from Toby Gifford, who has a system where the computer listens to the music which is being played, in real time does some analysis of what's going on, and then contributes an improvised part of its own to the ensemble. And so these kinds of things are possible. So they're not pipe dreams, that they happen. In the professional arts community, these things are being developed and used. I suggest that there's an opportunity for what David Perkins calls junior versions of these kinds of things, you know, slightly less full-on versions of these, to be utilised for people who are not in this professional artist stratosphere, but for normal, you know, or regular folk, let alone folk who might have some disability or may need some support in making their artwork. So I'm advocating, I guess, for looking at these things, these junior level versions. And as an example, you can think about the things that Barb talked about and Steve's talked about with the Jam to Jam process as an example of such a thing. And these are some of the things which I think are the advantages of these. Let's talk about them because they're worth spending a bit of time on. The notion of access is really critical. Most of these systems, because they have a semi-automated kind of function, are relatively straightforward to just get going. Yeah? They don't require a lot of practice and skill just to make something go, unlike a guitar, right? Which does require a bit of practice. Yeah? You can get something going pretty quick, right? Even quicker than getting a guitar. When you can strum it, it's not that hard, right? But we're lowering the threshold of access, yeah, with a lot of these automated systems, because we can modulate the input from the person, the operator, if you like, the person and the machine, and we can modulate that influence to meet some prescribed thing, and we can adapt it over time. As skill increases for the person, we can decrease the amount of autonomy that the system has, and we can balance that out. The other thing, of course, is leverage, and leverage is common to all tools, right? We talked about the spade and the shovel, right? It's quicker to dig with the front end loader than either, so that's just a technology thing. Technology always provides us with leverage. Inside us, we may have some creative urge, and if we can leverage that urge through technology, then that's a good thing. The notion of connection, I think, is complicated. There's connections happen at all sorts of levels. There's connections between the person and the art-making process. There's connections between the person and any technology, in an interaction sense. There's connections with other people through the process of art-making, you know, etc., etc., etc. There's collaborative things which cause obvious connections and networks. So there's all sorts of layers of connections which we can discuss. And the last thing is authenticity. I started with the first slide about people's fear about computing. One of those things was about things being inhuman. And we were very concerned about this in our research on Jam to Jam, about whether or not the experience of making music with Jam to Jam was an authentic music-making experience, or was it somehow inauthentic, therefore different, which made it either bad or somehow just simply different. Our preliminary results would suggest that it is an authentic experience, that the kinds of creative feelings and expressions that people have in these kinds of modulated systems is identical to those that they would otherwise have outside of that. The difference really is because why is that? We don't know for sure, but my suspicion is that as you become skilled as a painter, or skilled as a pianist, or skilled as a dancer, or some way, generally what happens is that the activities of doing that highly skilled activity go away from your consciousness. Yeah,
autopilot.
They become automatic, and this is a sign of fluency in that art form. Therefore, what's happening is that during that time, those things are kind of, as Andy says, they're on autopilot. So you get very close to the aeroplane's sort of metaphor there, okay? Those things become automatic. The things that you're focused on are the things about artistic expression and what I want to say and what I'm trying to do, and all of the motor movements and other things are in the background. The fact that the brain can parallel process those things is just interesting. Whether or not you split those processes between a human brain and a computer, you know, I'm suggesting it's not that dissimilar. The experience is if you have a surrogate machine which is operating like your brain would on all these automatic processes, the experience of actually interacting with that is similar to the one of interacting with yourself, given that you were doing the whole thing yourself. That seems to be what our research would indicate. So this would say that a lot of these experiences can be very authentic, even though there's artificial processes involved. So what does this lead to? Basically, when you do these kinds of things, you basically you're increasing engagement and participation. Barbara's covered this territory really well, I don't need to do that. But in this situation, we've got these computing systems, and we can see that, you know, this is a site or a location, a sort of an object that facilitates this kind of focusing of attention, and activity and so forth. So these kinds of systems can become a locus, if you like, for this kind of activity, a stimulus for this activity. I don't think necessarily any more than, say, a recording studio does, or an easel and a paint kit does, but nevertheless, just as much and readily in that sense. You don't lose anything. So just to conclude, my last thing is a question. I start by saying I feel like a bit of an interloper. I don't really have a strong idea of how this connects. I would turn it over to you folk who understand the context and the situations you're working in much better than I. But I would just suggest that there is this opportunity to use computing systems in this way. I think it's an underexplored area of activity. And, you know, how do we move forward on this, and what do we understand about this? And I would expect that people who are on the ground would be concerned about whether or not the thing just works, and whether or not they find that the people that they're working with are enthusiastic and engaged and getting the kinds of outcomes they want from it. And that would be great, and we could look at that and assess that. The university types like me would be, you know, interested to observe that and then try and understand why that might be, you know, as well. And so this seems to me an opportunity where we can come together to work on these kinds of problems and have outcomes which are beneficial across the board, just to reinforce what Steve has been arguing. So I'll finish there and open up to comments and